Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Nexus Today Show, Cuba Libre. The Castros are in the past and the island is finally moving on. Or is it? 85-year-old Raul Castro is watching the new leader closely. How much power does he still have? What happens now with the United States? It looks like the old rivalry will continue. And no McDonald's, no Starbucks. They're saying visit Cuba now before it gets too touristy. Is that good advice? All that and more, including this, coming up right now in the Nexus. Hello, I'm Matthew Moore, and today in the Nexus we're taking a fresh look at Cuba. For the first time in decades, there's no President Castro. A good or a bad thing, and is it a good time for you to visit? We have a great panel here to help you make up your mind, including the veteran Latin American journalist Javier Farje. He says Cuba is very much open for business. Hannah Barkley is also a journalist and a photographer. She's in Miami right now, but she usually lives in Havana. And our final guest, Collin Laverty. He's actually in Havana right now and has been organizing special trips to Cuba for Americans for years. So now we're all gathered. Let's find out if the island is still in Castro's grip or if it's Cuba Libre.
For the first time in almost 60 years, Cuba will no longer be led by a Castro.
The Castro regime is the island's revolutionary dynasty, known for overthrowing a military dictatorship, but also criticized for stifling economic and political freedoms.
New president was chosen to succeed Raul Castro, who took over from his older brother Fidel 12 years ago.
Miguel Diaz-canel, 57 years old, a one-time electrical engineer. For the past 30 years, he's been a communist bureaucrat, slowly rising through the levels of power. Effective immediately, he is Cuba's new president.
Seremos fieles.
We will be faithful to the exemplary legacy of the Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro, historic leader of our revolution, and also to the example, the value, and teachings of Armed Force General Raul Castro.
He's just a figurehead. He's a puppet.
If the new president ultimately is still going to be answering to the Castros, how big a change is this really going to be politically?
I believe that tomorrow is going to look very much like today and yesterday.
The Cuban people will be no closer to freedom today than they were yesterday.
Their life is not going to change.
In a totalitarian system, titles really don't mean anything. Raul Castro will remain the head of the Communist Party and will really control the levers of powers. Policy will be set by the party that is Raul Castro. Raul Castro's son is in the Interior Ministry, in head of surveillance, and Raul Castro's son-in-law is the CEO of the largest holding company that controls about 90% of the Cuban economy.
You have military holding companies involved in provision of goods and services at the port terminals for cruise ships, buses, rental cars, hotels, marinas, etc. If you're not allowed to do any business with military companies, essentially you can't do business in Cuba.
All the business is run by state anyway, so none of it is going to the actual people.
So the Castro family, which is really a Cuban equivalent to the Corleone family, will continue to hold all the levers of power.
Yeah, Raul remains head of the Communist Party until its next Congress in 2021.
Plus ça change. Well, Hannah, come back to you. Everyone in that report pretty much said it's this, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. So that's true?
I would argue yes, and I would argue many Cubans would agree.
Fair enough. Collin, same thing? There's no change, really?
I would argue that the idea that things were going to change one day to another, of course, that's not the case. I would say that there's a gradual process of change happening in Cuba, and there's been a tremendous amount of change over the last few years. This is an incredibly important step in moving forward in that process. And so I think in the next 3 months, do we expect major changes? No. The social fabric has changed incredibly. We have a private sector, more access to internet, more access to media. And so, in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, as Cuba finds itself in the 21st century, yes, the country will be very different. And this is an incredibly important step in that process.
Javier, let me come to you. So if no one really thinks that the new guy represents an immediate change, why put a new face in there?
Because you need a massive change so nothing changes. basically the priority for Cuba now is the economy. They want to develop the economy and sort of copy a kind of like a Vietnamese model of mix of market economics and one state, one party state. So in that respect, not much is going to change. But don't forget that the generation that took power in 1959, on the new year 1959, the Castros and his comrades are dying, they are retired, and there's going to be a point in which Mr. Diaz-canel is going to be pretty much free to introduce certain reforms that he actually introduced in Villa Clara, where he was a governor, the province of Villa Clara, where he was the head of the Communist Party. He supported the LGBT community, for example, there. He allowed rock concerts, big, shocking thing, rock concerts in Cuba. So then we might see changes, but the big changes aimed at not changing much at the moment, but things might change in the future once he's more free to
Let me ask you about one other man we saw in that report, which was Raul Castro's son-in-law, a guy called Rodriguez. Now, he is running Gaesa, right, which we heard in there. The military is running a heck of a lot of Cuba's economy. As you can see, it is run by the military, a holding company. And there on the right of the screen, you see Raul Castro's son-in-law. Now, it owns about 50 companies, but they're huge, and they reportedly run between 40 and 90% of the economy. It's actually the biggest owner of retail chains, supermarkets, restaurants, and petrol stations, and tourism the same. 50 biggest hotels, pretty much all the big hotels on the island. And when it comes to money, they control all the credit card and money transfer transactions on the island. Collin, if I could come to you, I mean, that's not going to change, is it?
I don't think it's going to change, but I would say that, you know, that's a great talking point in Miami. In terms of its actual significance, the majority of the employees, I'd say 85–90% in Gaesa, are civilians. And then this idea that the money that goes to Gaesa is then used for military is completely false. If you look at Cuban military spending, it's, you know, almost obsolete. Right. And, you know, Cuba has a general budget. So whether you stay at a military hotel or a non-military hotel, it's going to the general budget, and then they decide whether that goes to health.
So basically the military is administering it, running it like a business, and then plowing it back into the country?
Exactly. It goes to the general...
Let me ask Javier. Javier, is that right? I mean, they're so pure-hearted?
Well, yes, actually. Not only, don't forget that, okay, they control mainly the tourist industry, the armed forces, but at the same time, they are joint ventures with other countries like Spain and Canada. They have opened up a bit more the foreign investment sort of policies. They started that in 2014. Before it was only 51, always 51 for the Cuban government, 49 for the foreign company. Now it's a bit different. So although they control most of the economy, but they actually have joint ventures with other countries who are invested in Cuba.
And the money isn't going into the Castro's pockets and the hands of the senior people in the Communist Party?
There's no evidence that that is the case. Don't forget that Cuba has a massive social program of education and health. That costs money, and that money is going to finance that, because in Cuba, whether you are earning more than others or not, whether you are working class or a doctor, and sometimes there's a difference in salaries, they all have the same benefits of education and health, and that costs money, and it has to go back to that.
Fair enough. Now, you mentioned they're moving towards a different model of economy. Do you mean towards the sort of Chinese model?
No, Vietnamese model.
Vietnamese model. Okay.
Yes. Well, basically, Vietnam has been trying to encourage Cuba to embrace market economics, which the Communist Party in Cuba they don't want to do that yet, to sort of transfer land that belongs to the state, because the land belongs to the state, run by small farmers, to private hands, and to follow. That's the model in Vietnam, following Vietnam, and that has helped Vietnam to live 30 million people out of poverty in the last 20 years. So they are trying to encourage the Cubans to move to that particular model rather than the Chinese model.
Hannah, when this announcement was made that Canal Diaz was going to be the new president, were Cubans impressed or nonplussed?
I mean, when I was walking around the streets of Havana asking people a few days before, you know, are you excited? What are your feelings about what's happening in the coming days? Many people looked at me with a blank face and didn't really know what I was referring to when I said, that there's going to be a new president in power. Many Cubans, see this change as, a change of face, but not necessarily a change in their day-to-day lives.
Yeah.
And the Cuban government is also very, very intentional about ensuring that this will be not necessarily more of the same, but this will be a continuous process of progress. They're not interested in reforming the economy from one day to the next. They're interested in a very slow but continuous and smooth transition. They've actually been really wary to use the word transition, and I think that's something important to know.
All right, Hannah, thank you for that. Well, whoever's really in charge in Cuba, across the Florida Straits, we have a relatively new and skeptical president in Donald Trump, who very much wants to keep Cuba at arm's length, at least on the face of it, undoing the work of his predecessor.
Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba. We will end an outdated approach. We will begin to normalize relations between our two countries.
El pueblo cubano agradece esta justa decisión.
The potential moment of history in the making. A senior administration official tells NBC News President Obama will visit Cuba in the coming weeks.
I think the work that we've done has been successful. I don't anticipate major changes in policy from the new administration.
Donald Trump struck another blow against President Obama's legacy Friday when he announced that he was bringing back restrictions on travel and trade with Cuba.
Effective immediately, I am canceling the last administration's completely one-sided deal with Cuba.
The Cold War language prevailed in the ceremony. President Trump's policy constitutes a setback in bilateral relations.
We will continue to respectfully disagree with a number of our American friends on the way they engage with Cuba.
Cuba is ruled by the same people who killed tens of thousands of their own citizens and who once tried to host enemy nuclear weapons 90 miles from our shores.
Stop falling back on Cold War policies that didn't make sense decades ago and make even less sense now.
Easing of restrictions on travel and trade does not help the Cuban people.
Los individuos y grupos que hoy parecen tener mayor influencia sobre el presidente norteamericano son partidarios de una conducta agresiva y hostil contra Cuba.
Communism is the past, freedom is the future.
Yeah, but does it make any difference what Trump has actually said? Let's find out about the detail. Collin, what specifically substantive details have changed since Trump took over since Obama?
I think that's a good question. I don't know what's more humorous, President Trump saying that he canceled Obama's deal or the Cuban Americans that were applauding him, because almost nothing has changed. There's a list of military companies you can't do business with directly, but you can do business with them indirectly. Travel's been tweaked, but it's still very legal and easy for Americans to travel to Cuba. I'm looking out the window and I see a cruise ship. So there's rhetoric about, change in terms of what's actually changed in policy, very little. And I just add, as Trump goes and wines and dines princes in Saudi Arabia, and he's soon to visit North Korea, this idea that he cares about human rights, democracy, or the Cuban people, who he's actually hurting through his policies, is quite preposterous.
Is it helping the Cubans to have it opened up to America?
It would take 10 minutes to walk around Havana or any other city in Cuba and let the Cuban people tell you about how they're being hurt and they're suffering because there's less Americans coming here, spending their money, supporting their businesses.
Okay.
And I would just also closing the embassy so that Cubans cannot get visas to visit their family members in Miami, and folks in Miami have more trouble coming to visit the island, is causing a great deal of suffering. For
the embassy is still open, right? The U.S. Embassy in Havana?
It's essentially a ghost town functioning at a lower level than it's ever functioned over the last 30 years.
Okay, thank you. Hannah, let me ask you about the U.S. embargo on Cuba. Is it still very much in effect, and what effects does it have?
I would say it's very much in effect. And if you, as a tourist or you as a Cuban, walk around Havana, you can see the effects of the embargo in your day-to-day life. You go into, if you go into a supermarket, if you go into, the Cuban equivalent of of a Home Depot or a hardware store. You're not going to find a variety of anything really. And of course, the Cuban state.
So why didn't Obama lift the embargo then?
No. I mean, he effectively tore apart, line by line, everything he could to dismantle the embargo without being able to do exactly that.
Yeah.
But he did that by lifting most of the visitation restrictions and travel restrictions. I mean, when you were in Cuba 2 years ago, the feeling was very different. Right now, it feels like a shadow of what it once was.
Javier,
only 24 months ago.
One thing that a lot of commentators say was, if the United States is tough, even if it's just verbally tough with Cuba, it gives the regime in Cuba a scapegoat, really, for their economic problems. Is that correct?
Well, not necessarily. Listen, the problem that Trump has is that the business sector in the U.S. are not very happy with his restrictions. They are not very happy at all. The American Chamber of Commerce have been lobbying against the embargo. Thomas Donahue, the president of the chamber, was in Cuba 4 years ago when I was there, and he was meeting the leaders of the revolution in Cuba. I'm going to give you two people, Jerry Moran and Jeff Flake. You've never heard of them. They are two Republican senators who are against the embargo and against restrictions for Cuba, for American businesses in Cuba. Now, unless they belong to the Marxist-Leninist wing of the Republican Party, which I don't think exists anyway, they know very well that if these American businesses don't do business with Cuba, somebody else will.
Like who, the Chinese?
The Chinese, the Russians.
Okay, of course, one of the oddest aspects of the Cuban-US relationship is what's going on at Guantanamo Bay. If you zoom in on the map here, you'll find it is not on one of those little rocky outcrops. It's actually on the main island of Cuba. The Americans have leased it since 1903, about 1 year after Cuba became a republic. They pay just under $5,000 a year for the privilege, and as of January 2018, they had 41 detainees there, and they actually have it on a perpetual lease, which means that they can't end that deal unless both parties choose to end it. Let me ask you, Collin, is this a very sore point with the Cubans?
I would say lease is a very favorable and friendly interpretation of the deal. I think occupation would be a better...
Well, that's what Castro said, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
And I would just say, I mean, I think it's symbolic of the relationship between the United States and Cuba. You have the strongest power in the world 90 miles away from a small island that's fighting for its independence and sovereignty, and you actually have, an occupation on its land, something they've requested to have back for 50 plus years and haven't been able to achieve. And I just say the icing on the cake would be the detention center there. And so while the U.S. criticizes Cuba for human rights and lack of freedoms, some justified, some unjustified, we have waterboarding and other significant human rights and violation of international law and torture placed on a piece of occupied Cuban territory.
Okay. Yes. Collin, thank you. Well, the big worry for some is that if Cuban-American relations do improve too much, then the island will be overrun by American tourists and American fast food chains. Uncle Sam would change the island forever.
Agent McCauley, I want you to take over our Cuba file. Make sure it's all up to date now.
Yes, sir. Looking at it now. Okay, what do we got here? The Republic of Cuba, 150 kilometers from Key West, Florida. That's close. You could swim that. Who's that woman? Diana Nyad? There we go. The first woman to swim it without a shark cage. Nuts. Anyway, population just over 11 million, 64% white, 26% mixed, 5% black. 2.1 million live in the capital, Havana. Government, communist. And that's a rare thing these days. Who else is left? Just 5 of them. And they're not even really, well, maybe that one. Well, I guess that explains why they sell the most to Russia and buy the most from China. GDP per capita kind of on the low side there, $11,900. What do we got? $59,005. That's 5 times more. And how are they spending their money? Okay, look, 11% of GDP goes on health. USA, 17% of GDP. Oh, how comes they have 3 times as many doctors as us then? Huh. Life expectancy, 78.8. USA, 80. Not much difference. But it is a tiny little island compared to us. Oh, on the other hand, it's 10 times bigger than Jamaica. Oh, the biggest island in the Caribbean. Must be some nice beaches. Oh.
Thinking of beautiful beaches? An island paradise preserved in time? Come to Cuba before it all changes. We have some of the best sand, sea, and sun anywhere in the Caribbean. Playa Paraiso, Varadero Beach, Playa Los Flamencos, and pristine reefs, unspoiled by mass tourism. And when you're not sunbathing, visit Old Havana. Spanish colonial architecture and not a McDonald's or Starbucks in sight. Cut off from much of the world for years, we've learned how to repair almost anything, so you'll think you're back in the 1950s. Neat! Hurry now, before it all changes.
McCauley, you done yet?
All done here, sir. Ready to go. Well, that brought a smile to their faces. Collin, is it too late to visit Cuba before all the Americans turn up and spoil it?
Of course not. I mean, I think that this idea that Cuba is going to change overnight and because of America is undersimplifying the Cuban people. So I think that'd be number one. Number two, Cuba's incredibly dynamic, great people, great culture, great history. It's more exciting and more interesting than ever, and I feel confident that it'll continue to go into the future.
Collin, it was a bit of a mean question. You shouldn't ever say that because certain people turn up, they spoil it. What I meant by that was, it's just that they're so dominant and their branding is so dominant. Right now, Cuba looks very much like Cuba.
Of course, and that's the way it should be, and I am confident that it'll continue to be that way. The Cuban people are incredibly well educated, they're friendly, they understand that they're special because they're different and that they only get one chance to spoil that, and they need to think about that, and that's why they're making changes, but doing it in a way that'll preserve what's good.
Okay, but when Obama warmed things up between the two nations, it went from a few 100,000 to, you said 1 million, I think, last year. Is that just going to go up and up and up?
Well, most estimates say that if the embargo was completely lifted and Americans could travel freely, you'd have 2 million Americans visiting each year. Last year, we were at 1.5 million between Americans and Americans. So yes, I'd expect that in the coming years, when Americans are finally free to visit Cuba, you'd have millions of Americans coming.
Okay, Hannah, how many Americans? Sorry, I wanted to ask you about McDonald's and Starbucks. Do you see any of those around on the island?
No, you don't see any of those.
Coca-Cola?
What you do see is a lot of Cuban ingenuity. So you see a lot of, plays on McDonald's and Starbucks that I'm sure once McDonald's and Starbucks do come to Cuba, there will be a lot of legal issues because of copyright infringement.
Give me some really close copies of them, perhaps.
Exactly. And you know what? They may do it better even than the original.
Oh, okay. Javier, you were mentioning to me on the phone before we got into the studio that it's very much open for business. It's a great place to go.
Yes, it is.
Tell me why.
Because people are friendly, because the atmosphere is great. The beaches are absolutely superb. The food these days is first class. And people are very welcoming. We mustn't forget that, the Cuban people have been sort of isolated in many ways for years, and now they're opening up to new arrivals. I mean, Collin mentioned the 1.5 million Americans that arrived. They are a part of the 4.7 million people that visited Cuba in 2017. I've been there twice for work and for pleasure. And for both, and I can tell you, it's just a great place to go. People are extremely friendly. They don't have this Marxist or Leninist approach to
But will the Communist Party allow the big chains like Starbucks and McDonald's and Coca-Cola to show up? From what I hear, Cuba is one of just 2 places in the whole planet Earth where Coca-Cola doesn't have an official presence, the other being North Korea.
Because they don't need it. You see, the drinks there are great. The coffee is superb. Why would you need a Starbucks when you have a Cuban coffee? Or I mean, it really doesn't make any sense. I mean, I come from Peru. In Peru, we reject those kind of things because we have superb food. Why do you need a burger when you can have a wonderful sort of dish of chicken and beans and rice in Cuba? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So in terms of that sort of aspect of the commercial things, they don't need it. They may one day maybe, but I don't think they will.
You make it sound great, Collin. There are people who go to Cuba and they say, come on, let's not con ourselves. The Cubans also want to see progress. They also want good internet and new cars and so on. Let's not romanticize the whole place. What do you think?
I mean, I agree completely. I think that there's certain things in Cuba that the Cuban people want, including fast internet, more options of what they can buy. And I think that that's their right. It's the right for Cuban people to decide that. I think it'll help when the United States gets out of the way, both on business, but I also think that there's more space for debate and pluralism in Cuba when there's not a hostile enemy affecting things internally. And so I would say, I agree with you that we can't oversimplify the Cuban people, that they're all happy, they're all friendly, and they're all dancing salsa and drinking rum. Also looking changes, but again, at their own pace and with their own context.
All right. Well, strange you should mention salsa, Collin. That's like you read my mind there. Anyway, we've run out of time for this week. Collin Laverty, thank you very much for joining us here in the Nexus, and also Hannah Barclay Cohen, thank you. Oh, the music is back. Javier Farje, thank you for making your second appearance here in the Nexus. The music is back, and so are our friends from Dance Latin West London. Adios.
Voy a hacerte una versión de las tantas que han habido. 2 mujeres y 3 maridos buscaban su ubicación.